Hello all! Today we're going to be covering Chapter 11, which is delivering the presentation. And this chapter will be really helpful because we are going to start to prepare and plan for both our career research presentation and our sales presentation. And obviously you'll have to do a lot of these types of presentations within the workplace, within your personal life, etc. So all good tips to have moving forward. Knowing that, we're going to break down our lecture into 3 parts today. The first of which will cover types of delivery. The second will cover guidelines for delivery, and this will include some visual, verbal, and vocal elements, as well as how we handle Q&A sessions. Lastly, we'll talk about speaking with confidence, where we address some communication apprehension, and then just generally switching that over into a more confident and positive approach. But we'll start here with some overview, and the first thing I want to talk about is immediacy. And immediacy is that direct or instant involvement that we can have with our audience. We can create immediacy both verbally and non-verbally. So verbally, we build in those connections to the audience right away in the introduction of our speeches. Then we know that that's a continuous process, right? We don't just do it once. It's something we connect to the audience at every step of the speech making process, presentation making process. Also with our nonverbals, guys, especially when we're in face-to-face situations, you can create that closeness right away. You are in the here and now, you are in the moment with your audience, you can read their nonverbal reactions, and you can even step forward when you really want to create that immediacy and draw attention, right? So with our delivery style, we have control over that involvement with our audience based on how we present that information. Immediacy can still be done in written communication, but I don't think that we can control that aspect quite as much. So for instance, you could set your importance on an email to high importance, and maybe that creates some immediacy in the very essence of the word, right, where we know that we might want to respond or look at that email more critically or set it as a priority in our day, right? But immediacy, really, we want to create in that face-to-face context, and we know that face-to-face is the richest form of communication. So I encourage you, whenever you can have that face-to-face interaction, even via Skype or FaceTime or Zoom, we want to shoot for that, especially in the business and professional setting. We'll talk about what are the advantages of delivering a presentation face-to-face versus sending the message in writing. And guys, there is advantages to sending messages in writing, such as you can go back and reference that email or that letter and really look over exactly what needs to be done, or maybe you want to document a conversation or document some contingencies in a contract, whatever it may be. So there is definitely a place for sending things in writing, or if you're just asking for a quick note and they can reply back and you don't need to set aside the time for that face-to-face meeting, all benefits of writing, right? But there are a lot of advantages to delivering a presentation face-to-face. So especially if you're thinking about delivering hard or sad news, maybe you always want to have that face-to-face connection if possible. Maybe you're breaking up with a significant other. Our tendency, especially in our technology-ridden society, is to just take the easy way out and send that text message, right? But we know that we really want to approach that in a face-to-face setting so that we can offer, again, that immediacy and that connection to the other person in the audience. And we talked about those situations for writing where it might be beneficial to have a record of the conversation, you have a quick question, etc. Now I want to touch on to some theories before we get into the types of delivery, and these theories are very applicable to delivery. So the first of which is nonverbal expectancy theory. And typically, guys, we always expect the best of people. So especially in the public speaking situation, we expect that speaker to be very, very prepared. We know what to expect from various situations. So you know what to expect from a collegiate lecture. You know what to expect if you watch the presidential debate. You know what to expect if you have a guest motivational speaker, for example. And the audience believes what they see. So, for instance, we have this expectation versus reality. It's kind of like a hashtag going around on social media, right? And if you think of online dating, if you see people's profile pictures or even their Instagram, their Facebook, those are the expectations of how that person is, how that person looks, what their likes and dislikes are. So I could say that I am an absolute football fanatic if I put that on my Facebook or my Instagram. And then somebody actually meets me and decides to ask me about football, my favorite teams or whatsoever. And guys, I'm not that big of a football fan. I think it's enjoyable to watch every once in a while. I like the snacks that come along with watching football games and the Super Bowl and all of that. But do I know the players? Do I know exactly what's going on in a play? Can I interpret a foul or whenever they blow the whistle? I could not. So the reality of that situation is much different than what is expected based on my profile, for instance. This also applies to speakers. So we expect politicians to be very polished and have an example that is prepared and a statement prepared for most of the questions asked by a reporter. And if that person stumbles or doesn't have a good answer, our expectations are violated of that person, and likely their credibility goes down in our book, right? Other examples, guys, I'm going to show you a video from America's Got Talent, and then we'll discuss it here in a second. But remembering, we believe what we see, and if that speaker or person violates that in a positive way, our expectations go up. Typically, though, it is negative, and our expectations go down, their credibility goes down, like my politician example. Here's a positive one, rarer, but very cool when it happens.
She's just a girl and she's on fire. Better than fantasy, lonely like a highway. She's living in a world and it's on fire. Feel we catastrophe, but you know she can fly away. Whoa, she got both feet on the ground and she's burning it down. She got her head in the clouds, but she's not backing down. This girl is on fire. This girl is on fire. She's looking on fire.
So there we saw a 9-year-old girl, tiny little girl, deliver a song in a very big voice, right? So oftentimes you'll hear people say, I didn't expect that big of a voice to come out of that small of a person, right? So they violated their expectations of what was expected of a little 9-year-old girl and her singing ability in a very positive way. And again, those are less common than, unfortunately, the opposite, where people do not meet our expectations. That ties into emotional contagion theory as well with my example there, because I don't know about you, but I end up smiling every time I watch the video. So she's so good, the audience is so engaged and so smiley and happy about that situation that we catch, as an audience ourselves, catch the emotions of those people. They're surprised, good nature, they're clapping, etc. Conversely, if we were to watch a singer delivering a presentation or a song delivering a song where they are talking about a somber topic, or maybe they are even getting choked up themselves as they are presenting, in those situations I tend to get teary-eyed, and we again catch their emotion in that sense. I typically cry even if I don't know the other person or know why the other person is upset. Just seeing that other person upset makes me upset, just additionally, right? So we tend to catch the emotions of others. So as a speaker, we have a lot of responsibility there. We want to set the tone for our message so that it matches the content. If it's an enthusiastic speech, as presenters, we must be enthusiastic. Otherwise, our delivery doesn't necessarily match well, and it won't come away, the audience won't come away with the intended message. So delivery is very, very, very important. So now we'll talk about style in terms of types of delivery. And our text talks about three. So the first is monologue. And monologue are speeches delivered without interruption or audience involvement. So our book gives the example of presenting an award where there's no really Q&A in that instance. Another thing that pops to mind is like a eulogy at a funeral, right? So not a lot of question and answer, not a lot of interaction with the audience. Typically for larger or more formal settings, those are fitting for monologue type situations. Then you can have a guided discussion, and this is where obviously you're asking for some more audience involvement here. The speaker is still very much in control of the situation, however. Listeners are encouraged to speak up, and sometimes this is worth it because the audience feels that they are more engaged in the presentation, they have more buy-in. Next, we'll talk about interactive presentation, and this is where it's more of a conversation than the formal public speaking type of setting, and this is great for sales types of presentations where the listener, as the speaker, you're almost the listener taking a step back, and you are letting the buyer in the sales situation really run the show. So there you can see where it's more conversational. Obviously, the salesman is still in the essence of things leading the conversation, but they are taking a step back there and allowing more of that interaction so that they can meet the buyer's needs. All right, now we will transition into types of delivery in terms of manuscript, memorized, and extemporaneous speaking. So thinking of manuscript speaking, this is where you are speaking directly from a script. So for instance, if we look at this Better Homes and Gardens magazine, if you were to kind of tell us about this magazine and read this cover to us, directly just holding the magazine and the audience couldn't see it, for example, would it be very easy for them to follow the text and the messages on this cover? Probably not. Right, so that's where extemporaneous comes in, which we'll talk about here in a second, where you can kind of see the audience's reaction and adjust your message, and it's not necessarily just read to the audience. You can position, you can have conversational phrasing, and those kinds of things. So speaking from a script does have its advantages. Again, maybe eulogies, that monologue type of speaking would be good to have something directly written out. It's an emotional speech, and maybe you just really want to rely on that script. And that's an instance where it might be really good to have the manuscript. Other examples are if you're watching the news, so the news anchors have a teleprompter in front of them, so they are reading directly from a script to maintain accuracy. Politicians will also do this sometimes, and that you can see the benefit of that. But the disadvantage is it's hard to maintain interest with manuscript style speaking. So for instance, when you're watching the news, typically clips with the news anchors are 15-30 seconds, maybe a minute long, and then they're switching to a commercial or another visual element to keep the audience engaged. So advantage there, you have high accuracy. Disadvantage, hard to keep the audience involved. Memorized, you're reciting word for word from memory, so there you don't have any notes. You can make eye contact, you can move around all you want. Disadvantage to memory is we memorize in a rhythm. And oftentimes you will recite in that same rhythm that you memorized. If you lose your place, such as you lose your place in a song, you lose your place in the ABCs because we memorize that in a song rhythm. You often have to start over. You can't pick up your place because you are out of sync with how you memorized that. So advantages and disadvantages there to memorize. Typically we don't want to memorize. It sounds very rehearsed, and we want more of that conversational element to create that immediacy that we talked about with our audience. So we really shoot for extemporaneous speaking in the presentation speech situation. This is planned and rehearsed, but it's not memorized word for word. So we want to create these speaking notes, and I always encourage speakers to use the small handheld note cards. That still allows you to gesture, and you can keep the notes brief. You can have them to look down. It's kind of a safety net, especially when we talk about communication apprehension there. Also, if you've memorized things, you have nothing to fall back on should you get nervous or again lose your place. We want our speaking notes to be brief. We want them to be legible so that you can just quickly glance down. You don't have to pull them up and say, oh, let me see here as you're reading your notes, okay? And they're unobtrusive, so again, I suggest those small ones so that they're not distracting to the audience. Larger paper is going to a communication apprehension. Side effect often is shaky hands, and if you have those larger papers, then the audience can hear them or see them shaking. And that smaller note card with that thicker cardstock paper is better for those types of things. So example here of extemporaneous speaking. Pretend this is your note card talking about the University of Wyoming. So it actually says all of these words if you were to read word for word what you had planned. But when you get to the presentation situation, you're going to talk about this conversationally and your phrasing might not be the same. So for instance, I might say, the University of Wyoming offers a world-class education in the small little community of Laramie, Wyoming. This university is founded in 1886 and typically welcomes about 14,000 students from all 50 states in the United States and 40 countries worldwide. It's a land-grant university dedicated to serving the state of Wyoming and producing global leaders with its graduates. At the University of Wyoming, you can study anything from agronomy to zoology, criminal justice, theater, and dance. So my phrasing was similar, but not exactly the same as what I had planned out. I didn't read it to you directly, sounded a little bit more conversational and in the moment with the audience. So you could write this, you could highlight exactly the things that you want to make sure, your keywords, what you want to make sure that you say. Maybe your note cards even just have those keywords and you can phrase them together because you have planned and practiced this type of presentation. The last one we'll talk about here, guys, which I think I forgot to say in my initial preview, is impromptu. So we want to anticipate when you may be asked to speak. So these are off-the-cuff speeches, not planned. You may not even know that you're going to be speaking in a certain situation. So anticipate when you may be asked to speak when you're in that moment. You want to focus on the audience and the situation, so we're always considering our audience, thinking about how we can relate to our audience. You want to briefly organize your thoughts, so we talked about coming up with a central idea, main points, and support, an intro, body, and a conclusion. So you know kind of the basic format of a speech, and then thinking about whatever topic you have to speak on, how you can fit and cover each of those parts. I also put in here, you want to accept the opportunity to speak with confidence. So oftentimes people will be like, oh no, or I hadn't prepared. Just go with it, accept that opportunity, fake it till you make it, and do your best to organize well. Here's some tips there. So you have a thesis. Oftentimes your thesis will include those main points if you turn it into a blueprint, right? So you want to present your main points, then you want to present your reasons, logic, or facts to support those main points. And we always talk about tell them what you're going to tell them, so give them a preview with that thesis in the intro. Tell them what you're actually going to tell them, so elaborate there in the body. And then you want to tell them what you told them, so give them a summary and a nice closing statement. If you do stumble on yourself, mess up, or need to pause briefly, don't apologize. Stay confident. Go with it. Try and organize as best as you can in your head, maybe even thinking about an organizational pattern that you can follow and reference if you're very familiar with it in your head. And guys, try not to ramble. So we want to stay as brief as possible in these situations. I think it's a tendency to ramble in the impromptu situation because you don't have that time to prepare. So keep in your mind, I want to be brief. I want to stick to my plan. What are my main points? How can I elaborate on those, summarize, and close? Now let's think about some guidelines for delivery. First of all, focusing on visual elements. So one of the first things that we need to consider and that we can control as speakers is to dress effectively. And even in choosing our dress, we need to consider the audience. So seriously, every step of the speech making process, we consider the audience. A tip of advice for dressing effectively, you want to think about what the highest level of dress could be in your speaking situation. Maybe you are speaking to corporate employees, so you can expect at least somebody to be in a full suit, so you would need to be in a full suit as the presenter. If you are speaking in a school, likely you're going to have business casual. So for guys, slacks and a polo, slacks and a button-up shirt, maybe no tie in that situation. For ladies, you could have a similar attire. Maybe you're wearing a dress, something that is school appropriate as well. So always thinking about what is the highest level of dress in this situation, and then we want to match that. We never want to be underdressed in a situation. Next thing here, we want to step up and speak with confidence and authority. So I do a lot in terms of nonverbal communication here. We always want to think about our stance first of all, our stance and our posture. So we want to stand on both feet equal weight. We want to have our shoulders back in a professional posture, even posture, and even just in doing that, in setting ourselves up with what we call our speaker stance, our confidence automatically goes up. Another thing that I want to mention, I call this the starfish pose, but there's a TED Talk about this as well. So if you're interested in that TED Talk, send me an email and I'll provide it for you. But basically, it is that if you stand in a victorious stance, which is with your arms up like this and your legs out a little bit wider, that you are elevating your confidence just by your hormone levels. So this TED Talk speaker advises that before you go into an interview or a speaking situation, that you go and stand by yourself in this pose for 2 minutes with your head held high, and then when you go into those other speaking situations, you have those higher levels of hormones and you are set up to speak confidently there. So always thinking, I'm going to fake it till I make it. This TED Talk says, fake it till you become it. So step up, speak with confidence, have that authority, go into it with that strong speaker stance. Next then is your visual elements. So visually you want to set up any visual aids that you have before speaking. So you never want to get up there to speak and have to fumble around with any of your technology or your other visual aids. Have it all set up. You want to begin without looking at your notes. So you want to start by making direct eye contact with your audience members, surveying the audience. Now guys, this doesn't have to be something awkward where you go up and stand in front of the audience and you look around the room at everybody, okay? You just want to make sure that you have that connection with the audience. You're starting to create that immediacy with them by looking out and looking up at them. We never want to start like this. We always want to start open and present with our audience. We want to establish and maintain eye contact. So you'll have these brief glances down at notes. But largely we are staying focused on our audience members and not just on the people right in front of us. We want to be surveying the audience and seeing the whole room. What I often see when people use notes in this extemporaneous style of speaking is that we have a lot of time down here at our note cards with quick glances up at the audience. We want to do the opposite. We want to have quick glances down at our notes with the majority of our time spent on our audience. So establishing and maintaining eye contact is key in delivery. We want to stand and move effectively. So we talked about that stance, that open stance, confident stance. We want to seem firm. We are the authority in this situation, but we're still relaxed and conversational so that we feel approachable to our audience. We also want to move effectively. So oftentimes I instruct my public speakers or my presenters to move around. We never want to have tree roots. We never want to be stuck in one spot. We want to be able to move and engage our audience. A lot of times people take movement a bit too far and tend to pace, and then our audience is just following the speaker and gets distracted by their movement and they're not as focused on the message. So our movement needs to be purposeful. If you're new to moving or new to presenting, a good rule of thumb is to move as you transition. So move during those signpost areas of your outline and your preparation, and that'll just get you to engage with every side of the room. We also want to finish strong. So we've gotten through our presentation. It's important to really have that presentation's conclusion practiced. A lot of people tend to rush to the conclusion or even forget the conclusion. After we've finished everything that we have planned in terms of content, we want to pause, again, look at the audience, allow typically for people to clap, maybe move into a question and answer section. We don't want to pack up too early, so sometimes people will even be putting their note cards away or exiting out of their PowerPoint and releasing their jump drive, something along those lines. We really want to make sure that we are ending our presentation, taking that applause, looking at our audience, and then packing up when everything is through. Okay, going into a little more depth here in terms of immediacy, back to immediacy here. Immediacy is created with that eye contact. We just learned that in that section of delivery. Also our volume, so we want to be sure that we are projecting to the back of the room and that everyone in the audience can hear us. Before we prepare for our presentation, remember we're thinking about the situation. Maybe I need a microphone if the room is a bit big, such as you're in a gymnasium. Facial expression, we always want to make sure our facial expression matches the tone of the topic. So we talked about that with nonverbal expectancy theory and with emotional contagion theory. We want to make sure our gestures emphasize the content as well. So maybe you're giving a thumbs up, you're smiling in a happy situation, all that stuff. Posture as well, if we are hunched over as we present or leaning back against a wall. Emotional contagion theory, our audience will pick up on that posture and what message that sends in and of itself. So again, we want to be in that open, strong, but firm stance. Back here to how we talked about nonverbals, I gave you these statistics there. 7% of what we say is actually the words that we say. 38% is how we say it, so such as our tone. And 55% is our facial expression and our other nonverbal behaviors. So basically, guys, this is bad math. 93% of our message is created with immediacy. So how we say it, our tone, and our facial expression. So we can plan ahead of time for that 7%, but really how that information comes off and how well it is remembered is in the delivery. Effective delivery leads to enhanced audience recall. All right, guys, that is it for visual. Now we will move on to the verbal elements of delivery. We talked about the differences between written communication and face-to-face communication to start our lecture, and that goes with delivery as well. So our oral speaking style is very different than writing speaking style. We want to use short sentences and we want to use personal pronouns. So typically you are more formal in the way that you write and you are more elaborate in the way that you write. Knowing here, guys, when you are speaking, your audience typically can't go back and review your presentation unless it's recorded. So they are hearing this information in the here and now, and they get one chance to hear it unless they were to ask a follow-up question or something along those lines. But typically only getting this information once as the presentation progresses. We want to use short sentences to make sure that everything is understood. And we want to use personal pronouns here, a more inclusive conversational style as we present. That helps again with that immediacy. We want to use active voice using we and us. That also ties to those personal pronouns. Again, a here and now type of presentation. Contractions. We typically want to avoid contractions in how we write, especially in formal professional situations. But in speaking, that's a conversational style using contractions. We can't, we shouldn't, something along those lines. Also, you want to use names whenever you can. So specific names of people, rather than saying the salesman, you would actually use the salesman's name. Again, that creates that conversational feel, that active voice tailored to that specific audience. Also with verbal elements, we never want to emphasize our mistakes. So if you accidentally miss a note card, just keep rolling with it. Likely people aren't even going to notice. Maybe you can throw in some of that information that you wanted to cover in another place, and we have that ability with extemporaneous speaking, right? Also, it's just common to mess things up as you are presenting, and how you say things. What comes out of your mouth sometimes isn't what was going through your head. And in those instances, you can say, let me back up a second, or let me clarify, or let's go back to this statistic. Don't emphasize the mistake, just correct the mistake. We also want to be sure that we are using proper vocabulary for the situation and the audience. So thinking ahead of time, am I using jargon that the audience may not be familiar with? Do I need to include a definition? Are these people very familiar with these terms and I'm good to go without that definition? We want to make sure that we are pronouncing things appropriately, that if you don't know, you have looked up the pronunciation previous. Things with names, guys, if you're doing sources and you're not sure how to pronounce the name, don't try and phonetically sound it out or make it funny. Just roll with how it comes off your tongue the first time and let it go with that. Act like that is the normal pronunciation. I think that's the worst when people are fumbling around with an author's name. Just go with how it comes out, practice it beforehand, and that's good to go. Enunciation, we also want to make sure that all of our sounds are very clear for the audience as much as possible. Other things with vocal elements, we want to speak with enthusiasm and we want to speak with sincerity. So we never want to come off as fake. And oftentimes when people try and add dynamics, it's almost theatrical. So we still want to keep everything natural and within the bounds of our topic and the situation, but still being enthusiastic with our inflection, with our delivery, and maintaining that sincerity. We want to speak loudly enough to be heard, again, projecting to the back of the room. Try as much as you can to avoid disfluencies. It's something that I am still working on. Every speaker is still working on avoiding words. So you know is a big one. A lot of people will end each sentence that they say with you know. So those filler words, those filler phrases, do your best to just pause and then go on. But knowing that a few will fall in occasionally, we just don't want them to be overwhelming to the audience. We want to vary our speech, so we want to avoid that monotone approach to speaking and try as much as we can to add inflection, variation, changes in rate, even some strategic pauses work well in presentations. And that's the next one, to use pauses effectively. Maybe you want a statistic to sink in, maybe you want people to be able to think about the information that you just shared, but judge the time of those pauses. We don't want them to be too long, we want them to be just long enough. And we want people to recognize that it is indeed a pause and that it's meant for a purpose. So finding that balance there for whatever speaking situation or information that you are presenting. All right, guys, now we will switch to our question and answer session. What to do when answering questions here, first of all. Question and answer sessions are great when you are a presenter, but sometimes they cause a little bit of anxiety. So we'll talk about the best ways to handle question and answer sessions. The biggest thing is being prepared to answer questions, being very familiar with your topic, well-researched, and having some extra info that you can share in response to any questions. So during the presentation, are you going to take questions? So you might make that clear. You might promise to answer a premature question later. So can you save that question here? I might address it, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So sometimes people will be raising their hand during your presentation, and you can just quickly address them. Maybe you set that precedent at the very beginning of your presentation in the introduction of your speech. You also want to be sure that you are allowing for extra time when you are presenting your speech. So leaving 5-10 minutes, maybe even 15-20 minutes at the end of your speaking time so that you can address audience questions. And then if you're going to take these questions after the presentation, you want to maintain that you are in control of the situation as the speaker and that you are calling on various people to ask their questions one at a time, all that good stuff. When it comes to these answer questions, you can get the ball rolling as the speaker. A lot of times what people will say at the end of their speech is, does anyone have any questions? You want to be sure that statements like that aren't replacing your closing remarks to your speech. So those statements leading into question and answer are never the clincher of your speech. You still want to end your speech and your presentation strongly. Typically tying back to your attention getter is a good way to do that. And then you'll pause, allow for some claps, and then you'll go into this question and answer session. Also, does anybody have any questions? Is a very general lead-in to question and answer, and oftentimes people know that if they hear that, they're very close to the end of the presentation. If no questions are asked, you get to go home, so they're less likely to raise that hand and continue the conversation. So better ways to start this question and answer section is who has the first question. So you're just opening it up, you're there to stay, you're waiting for that first question. If nobody asks any questions, which happens often, sometimes that's a compliment, maybe you were very thorough in your presentation, you could start the question and answer with, typically I am asked, or a common question in this field is, and then you address that question, and then people might be more likely to raise their hand and pop in or have another idea for a question. Even before your presentation, you might anticipate likely questions, so things that are difficult to understand or things that have some controversy surrounding them. You might anticipate those questions and how you can possibly answer them so that you're prepared in that situation. Maybe you're looking out at your audience and reading your audience as you're presenting, and something looks a little bit hazy to people. Maybe they're frowning or they seem unsure. So you know that those might be questions that are coming up there. You want to clarify complicated or confusing questions. So if you're not sure you understand, maybe you restate the question or you paraphrase the question as to how you took it, and allow the question asker to be able to clarify. You always want to restate to make sure that you have heard things correctly, and then you can address the question most accurately. We always want to treat our questioners with respect. So you can say, great question, or thank you for asking that, or I appreciate your interest, and then address that question. You want to be sure, again here, that you are repeating the question and that you are taking everybody's question seriously. Another thing that goes with repeat here is sometimes people may not be listening to previous questions and they will ask the same question again. And it's very common for the tendency to be, I already answered that question, or so-and-so asked that and I said this. Don't do that. Don't try and try to avoid doing that, I should say. Try not to put down your audience members. We're always building people up, treating them with respect, so simply just re-answer that question for that specific listener. We want to keep answers focused on your goal. Our text says to avoid the word but, so we might say, yes, that did happen, but it wasn't our fault. That is a more defensive approach to the question, and instead we could say, yes, that did happen, and we're really not proud of that here at our company. And then addressing maybe what you've done to improve the situation or make sure that it never happens again, something along those lines. The next thing is to buy time when necessary. Maybe, guys, you don't know the answer to the question, and you can say, you know, I'm not really sure on that, but let me get your contact information after the presentation, and I will do some research and send you that answer here shortly. Always a good way to address the situation. You're not just saying, you know, I don't know, and leaving it at that. You're offering to do some extra work for that person. Maybe you return the question to that person and say, you know, what do you think? How do you think we should have handled that situation? Or turn it on the audience and ask for audience opinions. Phone a friend, right? But also, guys, buying time is something that everybody has to do. It's not just you. Sometimes you're not going to know the answer to the question. Sometimes you may need a little help in answering that question. So again, buying time when necessary. When answering questions, we also want to do our best to address the entire audience when we present our answers and avoid picking out one person, answering that specific question, only focusing on that one person that asked the question, because everyone is likely curious. So addressing the entire audience. Also, guys, we never want to say that was the last question or this is the last question, because maybe that question would bring a more negative feel to the presentation, and we always want to end on a strong note. So we would hope that that last question is very uplifting. But the way that we can go into end that presentation strongly is to follow what you consider to be the last question with a summary, and then it takes back the ownership of the presentation to you yourself, and you can make sure that you've ended on a strong note and again told them what you wanted to tell them, reminded them one more time about the main points of that presentation. All right, guys, now we're moving into speaking with confidence, the third part of our lecture today for Chapter 11. Going into our career presentations and our sales presentations, it's going to be normal, very normal, to have at least some level of anxiety just because you are going to be in that public speaking situation. So first of all, guys, as we get into communication apprehension, I want to ask you this big question: what do you fear? And everybody fears something in life. There's been a study done that says actually out of the majority of people, the number one thing that people fear is speaking before a group. Other things on the list are heights, insects, financial problems, deep water, sickness, and even death. So this study shows that public speaking is actually more feared by more people than death itself. So I'm not telling you that to make you more apprehensive about the public speaking situation, but rather to position that fear and let you know that you are not alone in that fear and that many people, most people, have at least some form of speaking anxiety. It actually has a name. It's called glossophobia, and this study says 74% of people suffer from some form of speech anxiety, and it's pretty even between genders. Now I want to ask you this next question. Whether your fear of speaking or another fear detracts you from actually wanting to do that activity. So I love to hike. I absolutely love to hike. And I love to hike uphill the majority because I never found myself scared of heights, like if I'm in a car or riding a horse or something like that. But if it's actually my feet where I am going down a very steep hill, I have super anxiety. Like I shake, my stomach hurts, I get very sweaty. Those are some other things we'll talk about here in a second in terms of speaking anxiety. But it makes me not want to hike some really beautiful trails and go to some really beautiful places. And it's something that I am constantly working on to get over that fear of heights when I'm hiking. So oftentimes people will avoid public speaking because of this fear. And really what we need to do is just get more comfortable in those situations. So I'm constantly forcing myself to go down those steeper hills and to gradually get steeper and steeper. Same concept applies to public speaking. Practicing makes perfect, but perfect is never really attainable. We're always still working towards that higher ideal and how we want to be as public speakers, how we want to be as hikers as well. So first of all, I want to talk about some symptoms after we know that this is a very common fear. So oftentimes people will experience an increased heart rate. They may shake a little bit, whether it's your hands, even your knees, your legs. Some people get a rash, usually on their chest or their neck, which you can also fix based on what you're wearing. So I'm wearing kind of a turtleneck type of sweater here. Maybe I would wear this in a presentation if I was someone that tended to get those types of rashes, and I could try and hide that a little bit. Just by my style of dress, then I wouldn't be focusing on that or thinking about that as I'm presenting. I've kind of taken care of that and looked ahead in terms of what I know about myself and my public speaking style. Some people get a flushed face. I've noticed that that typically goes away as the presentation progresses, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Oftentimes we'll perspire or we'll sweat as we get nervous, all very common things. I also want to point out these are the same symptoms we experience when we're very excited as well. So we can figure out, I know it's easier said than done, but how to approach this as public speaking situations and presentations in a more positive light and think about our nervousness or our anxiety as a chance to share what we know and an exciting opportunity. So I know that's again easier said than done, but those same symptoms, if we just cognitively switch how we think about things, can be applied to excitement and often are applied to excitement as well. So now I want to talk to you about this heart rate study, which often ties to sweating as well. So when our heart rate goes up, we might sweat a little bit more, we might get a little bit redder because we have that increased blood flow. But there's a heart rate study out there that talks about 4 speaking styles. There is inflexible, there is an average, there's a confrontational, and there is an insensitive. And guys, some people are inflexible speakers where you're just very, very nervous the whole time. So this study was based on the amount of time that you're speaking and your heart rate level. And on this graph, okay, there is the inflexible people that just have a high heart rate the majority of the time, and there's going to be a couple people that are always like that. Then there's the average person, and this means not the average person in a group, but they have an average heart rate. So kind of they approach this public speaking situation moderately positively, and they just kind of maintain that same heart rate throughout. Then there are the insensitive people, just meaning that their heart rate is not sensitive to the public speaking situation. These are typically people that speak all of the time that are very, very, very comfortable. And these are probably few people as well that are super comfortable there. Then there's the confrontational speaking style, where in the first 30 seconds to a minute of the speech, your heart rate spikes, and then after that you start to get comfortable, chill out, and your heart rate lowers as you go on. So a lot of people will get more comfortable as their speech goes on. you are probably a confrontational speaker, and that's about 70% of the population. Also, guys, with this heart rate study, they did kind of a placebo test in this study where they had heart rate monitors on people, and they had a green light or a red light depending on where their heart rate was. And they monitored these first people, and if they had a green light, their heart rate typically stayed where it was if it was low or started to go down. And if they had a red light, then they just maintained that level of anxiety because the light was telling them that they were nervous, okay? Then they also did this placebo test where even if somebody had a very low heart rate as they were presenting, they put a red light on there, and what did their heart rate do? It jumped. If they were nervous and had a red light and their heart rate was high and they put a green light, it started to trickle down. So what does this mean? Our head and how we approach the public speaking situation has a lot to do with how we react to that public speaking situation. Another thing we can focus on is we want to approach public speaking situations as a conversation. So we talked about using those pronouns and that we and us language. That also applies to us here. We want to approach this public speaking situation as a conversation and not as a performance. So you are not an entertainer here. You have this information to share. You have people that are willing to listen to this information, probably even have questions. They want to inquire more about your topic. So approaching as a conversation rather than a performance. Also with breathing, when we get nervous, we tend to breathe at the top of our lungs, where we're breathing a lot faster and even straining a little bit to breathe. So in the public speaking situation, you're even focusing on still breathing normally like you would in conversation here, taking deep breaths within your belly and less at the very top of your lungs. I even have people write breathe on their note cards. Some people forget to breathe. So we want to maintain that same conversational breathing as we would in a conversation when we are public speaking. Okay, now we will get into speaking with confidence here. Again, acknowledging that speech anxiety is common, you are not alone, and everybody is working with some form of speaking anxiety going into presentations. Another thing to remember here, apprehension isn't as visible as you think. So another way to phrase this is you are more nervous than you look. So we fake it till we make it, we dress well, we prepare well, and then we are able to handle those other feelings of apprehension within ourselves, but a lot of people won't even notice that you are nervous. So again, fake it till you make it there as you approach these public speaking situations. We want to accept a moderate amount of nervousness. So I always ask this example, how many of you played sports? A lot of people raise your hands. How many of you have performed like a musical instrument or something? And then were you nervous when you went and did those things? Most people say, yes, I absolutely was. I absolutely was nervous. And then we talk about why, because you want to do well, you've really practiced, it's something that you love to do, etc. And then you have that adrenaline going, so maybe you're very nervous before a game and you had an awesome game because you channeled that nervous energy. We want to do the same in speaking, channel that nervous energy, think about it as excitement, and let it propel us through our presentation. Obviously, guys, we can also speak more often. So the more often we do it, the more comfortable you will get. And putting yourself in those situations, even if uncomfortable at first, they will start to get easier as you prepare more often, as you present in front of various audiences, etc. So just speaking more often, taking those opportunities to speak whenever possible. Couple more slides here. Speaking with confidence, we really want to rehearse our presentation, and I know you've heard this over and over and over again, but always rehearsing will help take some of that anxiety away. When we rehearse, we want to be sure that we are speaking in the stance that we will be speaking in. So again, we talk about our speaker's stance, equal weight, posture back. You are going to practice just as you play. So getting in that stance, you want to expect to be 20% longer when you are practicing. So people tend to speak faster in presentations. So for instance, if you have a time limit or a time you need to meet, make sure that you have a little extra content when you are rehearsing. If you are close to time, you should be all right, but I would always say give yourself some wiggle room on either end of a time frame. You really want to focus on your introduction and your conclusion. People remember what you say first and what you say last the best. Also, most people are more nervous, that confrontational speaking style, right as they begin. So really knowing your attention getter and the introduction well is going to help you so that you start to chill out a little bit. Also, the conclusion, people tend to just want to be done. They rush through it or they forget. We know in order to have credibility and really present well, connect with the audience the best, we need to hang out for a second before we pack up and make sure that we have received the audience well. We want to practice in a real setting whenever possible, so finding an audience that you can present and practice on is great. You can also practice in front of the mirror so that you know how you look in your gestures and your movement, your expression. You can video yourself. I find that also very helpful so that you can hear yourself too. And then what can you do prior to ease anxiety? This is something else I want to touch on. Maybe you can walk to work that day, maybe you can walk to class that day. That just helps release some of that nervous energy. Other things, techniques, this is going to seem silly, but even just like flexing your leg muscles when you're sitting in your chair waiting to speak. Nobody knows that you're doing that, but your body is focusing on doing something else and releasing energy. Even clenching and releasing your fists, or holding on to your chair with a hand and clenching and releasing. Again, nobody around you is going to even notice, but you're just doing something to release energy there. But I do find that walking around, getting your energy out, doing your starfish pose, all those good things will help you as you approach these likely anxiety-ridden situations. But again, we can really get better at them, we can practice them, and we can approach them positively. Oftentimes you'll feel really good when you're done with your presentation and confident about that situation. Another tip here, you want to focus on your topic and the audience. So really relating to the audience and sharing what you know. You have really awesome things to share that you've prepared. Focus on how you can best present them to your audience and try and stay away from focusing on yourself and your fear. So focus on your message, not on your fear. Lastly here, we want to think rationally about the presentation. Something I always hear from students is that they feel like the audience is waiting for them to mess up. And guys, that's just not true. It's uncomfortable for everybody. When somebody is struggling in a public speaking situation, oftentimes I hear students say, oh, I really wish I could have helped him, or I just wanted to give him a hug. So we really feel for you. We want you to do well. It's uncomfortable if you're not. I'm sure you've been in a situation like that where you're just kind of sitting on your hands or fidgeting and it's just awkward. So we never want another person to fail. So your audience is really rooting for you and you need to keep that in mind. Myths here, presentations must be perfect. They are never perfect. Even in my lectures, I stumble over myself. Maybe I even have to restart a section. You can't do that in the public speaking situation, but just roll with it. Again, never pointing out our mistakes, just fixing them when possible, adding in some information if we missed a slide, adding it in somewhere else where it fits, or just even forgetting about it in those situations. So rolling through, knowing that no presentation is perfect. It's never going to go exactly as you practiced it. That's okay, that's natural, that's normal. It's never possible to persuade an entire audience. So you are shooting for the majority, hoping to persuade at least one or two people at worst. Majority at best. You're never going to get the entire audience to accept your proposition or move forward, or at least it's very rare. What's the worst that will happen? Don't think about those things. We always want to think about the best possible outcome and then deal with any other things that happen as a result. So always focusing on the positives, thinking about things in an excited way rather than a nervous way, and your presentation should go very well, especially when we're taking all of this time to prepare our speeches and when you've put in that practice to rehearse in that situation, doing your best to recreate how you think the presentation is going to go. Another thing that you guys have in your control is knowing the online type of situation that you'll be in, since we've been in Zoom together before. Knowing that your classmates will be your audience members, knowing how much time you have, knowing your topic well. So I am really looking forward to these career research presentations and these sales presentations. If you have any questions at all, if you want to rehearse with me in office hours, I'm happy to help in any way that I can. And I will talk to you all soon.